Buried century, Martwi. The Statue of Liberty was never about freedom. It sits on an 11-pointed star fort. Most people who visit the Statue of Liberty never look at the base. They take the ferry from Battery Park. They line up for the security check. They climb the steps to the pedestal. They look up at the green copper figure with the torch and the tablet, and they take their photographs, and they read the plaque about the huddled masses yearning to breathe free, and they get back on the ferry, and they go home. They do not look down. They do not walk the perimeter of the structure on which the statue is built. They do not count the corners. They do not measure the angles. And because they do not look, they do not see what is underneath their feet. They do not see that the statue they have come to admire is sitting on top of an 11-pointed star fortification that does not match anything else in the documented history of American military engineering. They do not see that the structure beneath the pedestal is older than the official record claims, that its geometry corresponds to fortifications built across multiple continents in centuries that predate the United States, and that the official explanation for its existence collapses the moment you compare it to the structures the same engineer is supposed to have designed elsewhere. The Statue of Liberty was never about freedom. It is a specific monument with a specific iconography, dedicated by a specific organization, placed deliberately on top of a structure whose origin has been deliberately obscured. The official story is so smooth, so well rehearsed, so universally accepted that almost nobody thinks to question it. But the structure is still there. The geometry has not changed. The masonry can be measured. The angles can be compared. And once you start looking, the cracks in the official narrative spread in every direction. They lead you to a network of similar structures across Europe and Asia, structures the textbooks insist were built in different centuries by different cultures for different reasons, but which all share the same impossible features. They lead you to a class of monumental sculpture whose iconography points back to ancient pre-Christian symbolism that has been scrubbed from the public-facing history of the project. And they lead you eventually to the larger question that the keepers of the official record have spent 2 centuries trying to keep buried. The question of what was actually here before, and who actually built it, and why we are not allowed to ask. This is the story of the 11-pointed star at the entrance to New York Harbor, what it actually is, and why the most famous statue in the world was placed on top of it. If you want more of these investigations, the kind of buried history the textbooks have spent generations trying to keep out of the public conversation, subscribe to the channel right now. New videos drop every week, and we go after the questions the official record has spent centuries closing. The official version of the story can be found on any government website. The structure beneath the Statue of Liberty is called Fort Wood. It was named after a Lieutenant Colonel Eleazar Wood who died at the Battle of Fort Erie in 1814. The fort was built between 1808 and 1811, designed by a young army engineer named Joseph Gilbert Totten as part of a coastal defense system erected by the United States in the years before the War of 1812. The site was an island in New York Harbor called Bedloe's Island, after a Dutch colonist who had owned it in the 17th century. After the War of 1812, the fort served various secondary functions for the rest of the 19th century. By the 1870s, when the French began discussing the gift of a colossal statue to the United States, the fort had fallen into disuse. The 11-pointed star walls were already there. They were a convenient pedestal. The statue was placed on top of them, and that, the official record says, is the entire story. There are several problems with this account. The first problem is the engineer. Joseph Totten is a real and well-documented figure. He graduated from West Point in 1805. He served in the Corps of Engineers for the rest of his career, eventually becoming the Chief Engineer of the United States Army. He designed and supervised the construction of dozens of coastal fortifications across the eastern seaboard and the Gulf of Mexico. His work is exhaustively documented. His designs are preserved in the National Archives. His correspondence with the War Department fills multiple volumes. And nowhere, in the entire documented body of his work, Is there another structure remotely like Fort Wood? Look at the forts Totten designed in the years immediately after Bedloe's Island. Fort Adams in Newport, Rhode Island, started in the 1820s, is a pentagonal bastioned fort with hornworks. Fort Monroe in Hampton, Virginia, started in 1819, is an irregular hexagon. Fort Macon in North Carolina, completed in the 1830s, is a 5-pointed star. Fort Pulaski in Georgia, finished in the 1840s, is a pentagonal casemated fort. Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, on which Totten worked extensively, is a pentagonal masonry fort. The pattern is consistent. Totten designed pentagonal and hexagonal forts. He used straightforward bastion geometry. He designed for specific defensive functions and specific lines of fire. His work is competent, conventional, and recognizable as American military engineering of the early 19th century. Fort Wood is not. Fort Wood is an 11-pointed star with a geometry that has no parallel in any other Totten design, no parallel in any other American military structure of the period, and no obvious defensive logic. Why would the same engineer who designed straightforward pentagons everywhere else suddenly produce an 11-pointed star at Bedloe's Island, never explain why, and never repeat the design anywhere else for the rest of his career? The second problem is the masonry. The walls of Fort Wood are constructed of cut granite blocks that are fitted with a degree of precision unusual for American military construction of the early 19th century. The corners are dressed with finished edges, the joints are tight, the stones are large, regular, and laid in courses that suggest decades of practice in master masonry. American military construction in the years before the War of 1812 was, by contrast, generally hurried. The Republic was young, the treasury was thin, the forts of the period were built quickly, with the labour and materials available locally, and they show it. They are functional, but rough. Fort Wood does not look like the work of a hurried American Republic in 1810. It looks like the work of an established European masonry tradition, the kind of tradition that produced the great star forts of the Netherlands, of northern Italy, of the German principalities. The masonry is too good for the period and the place, and when you compare it directly to the masonry of other Totten projects of the same era, the contrast is immediate. His other work looks American. Fort Wood looks European, and not just European, but specifically belonging to a tradition of fortification construction that was already considered antique by 1810. The third problem is the geometry itself. 11-pointed stars are not standard military geometry. The classical bastion forts of the 17th and 18th centuries used 5, 6, 7, or 8 points. The Vauban tradition in France, which dominated European fortification design from the late 17th century onward, almost never used star geometries above 8 points, because there was no defensive reason to do so. Adding more points reduced the field of fire from each bastion, made the perimeter harder to garrison, and complicated the supply lines. 11 points is, from a military engineering perspective, an irrational choice. It was not a Vauban choice, it was not a Cohorn choice, it was not a Totten choice, for the reasons already discussed. So whose choice was it? The 11-pointed star is, however, common in a different tradition entirely. It appears repeatedly in the architectural symbolism of certain European secret societies, in the cosmological diagrams of Renaissance Hermeticists, in the floor designs of certain cathedrals, and in the heraldic devices of certain ancient orders. The number 11 in the Western esoteric tradition has specific symbolic associations. It is the number of the threshold, of the gate between worlds, of the principle of mastery. An 11-pointed star at the entrance to a major harbour is not a defensive structure. It is a symbolic statement, and the people who placed an 11-pointed star at the southern entrance of New York Harbour were not interested in defence. They were interested in marking the entrance with a specific symbol drawn from a specific tradition. Now, here is where the story gets larger, because Fort Wood is not unique. It is one of a class of structures that exist around the world, structures that share specific design features, that are concentrated in particular geographic zones, and whose official explanations all suffer from the same kind of problems we have just identified at Bedloes Island. In the Netherlands, in the small town of Bourtange near the German border, there is a star fort whose construction the official record dates to the late 16th century, but whose underlying foundations have never been properly excavated, and whose alignment matches the Fort Wood alignment within a few degrees. In northern Italy, the city of Palmanova is built around a 9-pointed star with an inner 18-pointed bastion ring. In Hungary, in the town of Komárom, there is a system of fortifications that the textbooks attribute to the Habsburgs, but whose lower courses, examined directly, show stonework that predates Habsburg control of the region by centuries. In Russia, across the territory that older European maps label Tartaria, there are dozens of star fortifications, many of them in remote regions, many of them with 11-point or 12-point geometries, all of them officially attributed to 19th century Russian military construction, but none of them with documented construction records that hold up to scrutiny. In South America, the pattern repeats. The city of Cartagena de Indias on the Caribbean coast of Colombia is surrounded by a system of star fortifications that the official record attributes to Spanish colonial construction in the 17th and 18th centuries. The masonry of these structures, examined directly, shows multiple periods of construction. The lower courses, in many cases, predate the Spanish arrival in the region. The geometry of the fortifications corresponds to the same family of designs found at Bedloes Island in northern Italy, in Central Asia. The Spanish, by their own admission in the colonial archives, did not design these structures from scratch. They incorporated existing earthworks and stone foundations into their colonial defences. The existing structures are described in the early Spanish documents as having been there when the Spanish arrived. By whom they were built, the Spanish never determined. The local indigenous population had no tradition of monumental stone fortification. The structures, in the words of one early Spanish military engineer whose report survives in the Madrid archives, were of a type and quality that pointed to a culture of which the local people retained no memory. This pattern, repeated across continents, is the pattern that mainstream history does not want assembled in one place. Star forts of complex geometry are not a phenomenon of late medieval and early modern European engineering. They are far older. They are far more widespread. The named European engineers who took credit for them in the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries were, in many cases, the inheritors rather than the originators. They walked into landscapes already populated with these structures. They refurbished them, they incorporated them into their own military plans, and they wrote them up in their official reports in language that gave the impression they had designed them. The reports went into the archives. The archives became the source material for the historians of the late 19th and 20th centuries. The original origin of the structures, which was openly speculated about in the older travel literature, was quietly dropped from the modern academic discussion. Consider what the older travel literature actually says. In the 17th and 18th centuries, before the modern academic establishment had organized itself into a single coherent narrative about the history of European architecture, European travellers wrote about what they saw with a candour that the later academics found inconvenient. The German diplomat Adam Ilarius, travelling through Muscovy and Persia in the 1630s, described star fortifications in the interior of the Russian Empire that the local inhabitants attributed to a vanished civilization. He published his account in 1647. The book was a bestseller. It was translated into multiple languages and was considered a standard reference on the region for over a century. The German naturalist Engelbert Kempfer, writing in 1712, described similar structures in Central Asia and made the same point. The Frenchman Jean Chardin, in his account of his travels in Persia, described fortifications that did not match any known historical construction, and that the local people said had always been there. These accounts, taken together, paint a consistent picture. The territory east of the Vistula and south of the Volga was, in the 17th century, dotted with monumental star fortifications whose origin nobody could explain, that the local populations attributed to a vanished imperial culture, and that the European visitors recognized as superior in workmanship to anything being built in their own time. By the late 19th century, all of this had been quietly written out of the standard histories. The structures were re-attributed to 19th century Russian military construction. The travel accounts were dropped from the curriculum. The local oral traditions were dismissed as folklore. And the question of what had actually been built, where and by whom, was no longer something a serious academic could discuss in public without damaging his reputation. This is the moment of the rewrite. It happened across Europe and Russia, across Asia and the Americas, in the same decades, by the same kind of institutions, with the same kind of consequences. The world had inherited a vast architectural patrimony. The new academic establishments of the late 19th century took that patrimony and reassigned it to a much smaller and more recent set of named engineers, none of whom had the resources or the manpower or the time to have actually built what was attributed to them. The lie was never explicit. It was a lie of consistent omission, repeated until it became indistinguishable from history. And this is the context in which Fort Wood needs to be understood. The 11-pointed star at Bedloe's Island is not an oddity. It is one node in a global network. The masonry, the geometry, the alignment, all of it points to the same older tradition of monumental construction that we find scattered across the territories of historical Tartaria, across the older fortifications of Europe, across the inherited colonial defences of the Spanish Americas. The structure was already there when the United States took possession of Bedloe's Island. The American military engineers who took credit for it in the early 19th century did what their European counterparts had been doing for 200 years. They incorporated the existing structure into a new official narrative, dated it to their own period, attached it to a named designer, and wrote it up as if it had been built from scratch. So what was Bedloe's Island before it was Fort Wood? The honest answer is that we do not know with full certainty, because the records of the early colonial period are thin, and the records before the colonial period are non-existent. What we can say is that the island had been used and reused for various purposes for at least 2 centuries before the construction of the official fort. We can say that there are scattered 17th and 18th century references to structures on the island that do not match the conventional explanation. We can say that the 11-pointed geometry of the existing walls fits the broader pattern of inherited star fortifications across the world. And we can say that the choice of this specific site, with its specific geometry and its specific alignment, for the placement of the most prominent monument in the harbour was not an accident. The men who chose the site knew what was already there. They knew its symbolic associations. They chose it precisely because of those associations. The men in question were Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi, the French sculptor who designed the statue, Édouard de Laboulaye, the French politician who originated the project, Richard Morris Hunt, the American architect who designed the pedestal, Joseph Pulitzer, who ran the public fundraising campaign, and Gustave Eiffel, who designed the internal iron framework. All of them, by the public record of their lodge memberships, were Freemasons. The cornerstone of the pedestal was laid on August 5, 1884, by William A. Brodie, the Grand Master of Masons of the state of New York, in a public ceremony that followed the traditional Masonic ritual for the consecration of a public structure. Corn was scattered over the cornerstone, wine was poured, oil was poured. The cornerstone was struck 3 times with a gavel. A copper box was placed inside the cornerstone containing a copy of the Constitution, copies of the New York newspapers of the day, a list of contributors, and other items that have never been fully catalogued in any public source. The ceremony was attended by hundreds of Masons in formal regalia. It was reported in the newspapers. It is a matter of public record. The dedication of the statue itself 2 years later was similarly attended by Masonic dignitaries from across the country. The official iconography of the statue, when examined in detail, follows the symbolic conventions of the same tradition. The figure of liberty as Bartholdi designed her is not the figure of liberty as the United States had previously imagined it. The American iconography of liberty in the late 18th and early 19th centuries had been the figure of Columbia, a female figure in classical robes, often with a Phrygian cap or a sword, generally smaller in scale and more domestic in tone. Bartholdi's figure is something else. She is colossal. She wears a 7-rayed crown. She holds a torch and a tablet. She faces outward, toward the open sea, in the posture of a guardian of the gates. The closest historical parallel to her, by Bartholdi's own admission, is the Pharos of Alexandria, the great lighthouse of the ancient world, which was a colossal goddess figure standing at the entrance to a major harbour. Bartholdi's original concept for the figure had been developed for a different project, a colossal lighthouse at the entrance to the Suez Canal, depicting a robed Egyptian female figure holding a torch. The Egyptian project did not move forward. He reused the design for the American project. The figure that now stands in New York Harbor is, in its iconographic lineage, a direct adaptation of an ancient lighthouse goddess figure placed on top of an 11-pointed star fortification of unexplained origin, dedicated with the rituals of a specific organization. The 7-rayed crown is itself a specific iconographic choice. It was not a generic decorative element. It corresponded, in the iconographic tradition Bartholdi was working in, to the 7 planetary spheres of the older cosmological systems, the 7 rays of the older solar religions, the 7 hierarchical levels of certain initiatory traditions. The torch was the torch of illumination, in the specific sense that the term was used in the writings of the European Illuminist movements of the 18th and 19th centuries. The tablet, often interpreted in the public-facing version as the tablet of the law of the Declaration of Independence, carried older iconographic associations with the tablets of esoteric law as understood in the older Hermetic tradition. None of these associations are speculative. They are documented in Bartholdi's own correspondence, in the writings of his collaborators, in the published statements of the Masonic organizations involved in the project. They are simply not part of the public-facing version of the story that is told to the millions of tourists who visit the statue every year. What this means, when you put it all together, is that the Statue of Liberty was never about freedom in the sense that the public has been taught. The statue is a specific iconographic monument, drawn from a specific symbolic tradition, dedicated with the rituals of a specific organization, placed deliberately on top of an 11-pointed star fortification, whose origin was already obscured by the time of the dedication. The public-facing meaning, the immigration story, the huddled masses, the gift from one republic to another, was a layer of narrative paint applied over the actual symbolic content. The actual symbolic content was a marker placed at the entrance to one of the most important harbours of the New World, in the same iconographic language that had been used to mark major harbours in the older world, in a tradition stretching back through the lighthouses of the Mediterranean to the goddess figures of the ancient Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. And the 11-pointed star at the foundation is the deepest visible layer. It is what was there before the statue, before the official Fort Wood narrative, before the American Republic itself, in any meaningful sense. It points back to a tradition of monumental construction that the modern academic establishment has collectively decided not to examine. It connects by its geometry and its alignment and its masonry to the network of inherited star fortifications that span the territories of the older European empires and the territories that the older maps labelled Tartaria. It is the most visible piece of evidence in the most visited harbour in the world that the story we have been told about the construction of the modern world is not the story that the physical evidence on the ground supports. If the 11-pointed star at Bedloes Island is part of this older inherited tradition, then the official story of New York Harbor itself begins to look different. The Dutch did not arrive in a virgin wilderness in the 17th century. The English did not inherit a blank canvas in the late 17th century. The Americans did not build a new harbour on top of nothing. They inherited, layer by layer, a landscape that had been organised and built upon by something earlier, something the official record has chosen to forget, something whose physical traces are still visible to anyone who chooses to look. The 11-pointed star is the most prominent of those traces. It sits in plain sight, photographed by millions of tourists every year, hiding in front of everyone, while the public-facing story trains every visitor to look at the statue on top and not at the structure beneath. The same pattern repeats in city after city across the Americas. The old fortifications of Boston Harbor, the structures at Alcatraz and Angel Island in San Francisco Bay, the river forts of New Orleans, the harbor defenses of Charleston, all of them carry the same anomalies. Refined masonry that does not match the historical period, geometries that do not match the standard military traditions, construction records that disappear when examined closely, official explanations that collapse the moment the physical evidence is taken seriously. Every major American harbor has its own version of the Bedloes Island story. Every major American city has its own inherited layer beneath the official colonial origin. And every official tour guide, every National Park Service brochure, every textbook chapter on early American history is part of the same project. The project of training the public not to look down. The project of training the public to take the surface story at face value. The project of keeping the older layer invisible. Take Castillo San Marcos in St. Augustine, Florida. And the official record dates the structure to Spanish construction beginning in 1672. The masonry is composed of a local limestone called coquina, fitted with techniques that the Spanish colonial archives themselves describe as exceeding the capability of their own military engineers in the region. The geometry is a four-bastioned star with proportions that match the older European tradition more closely than any documented Spanish design of the same period. The walls have absorbed cannonballs in 3 documented sieges without structural failure, a level of performance that the Spanish themselves found surprising and that they attributed in their official correspondence to the unusual properties of the local stone. The Spanish reports, when examined directly in the archives in Seville, describe the early phases of the construction in language that is consistent with the incorporation of pre-existing earthworks and stone foundations, rather than the building of a new fortification on a virgin site. The standard textbook account of the Castillo, however, describes it as a Spanish original from start to finish. Take Fort Jefferson in the dry Tortugas, 60 miles off the coast of Key West. The official record describes it as an American military construction begun in 1846. The fort is a 6-sided polygonal masonry structure containing more than 16 million bricks. It was officially never completed. Construction continued for nearly 30 years and was abandoned. The American military, for the supposed period of construction, did not have the manpower, the supply lines, or the budget to have produced what is actually on the island. The bricks, the masonry, the engineering of the cisterns and the casemates, all of it points to a level of organized construction that exceeds what the documented American operations in the region could have achieved in the time allotted. The official explanation has held for over a century, but the math of construction does not support the explanation. And the alternative possibility, that the Americans inherited and extended an existing structure rather than building from scratch, is not seriously considered in any mainstream account. These are the kinds of inherited layers that the official record has been carefully edited around. The pattern, once you know how to see it, becomes obvious in every major harbour and every major early American military site. The public is not encouraged to see it. The textbooks do not invite the comparison. But the structures are still there. This is not a small thing. The largest monuments of the modern world, in the largest harbours of the modern world, have been built on top of structures whose origin has been erased from the public record. The erasure was not subtle. It was achieved through the standard tools of 19th century academic statecraft. Reissue the textbooks, stop translating the older travel literature, reattribute the inherited structures to recent named engineers. Train a generation of historians to repeat the new official line. Wait for the witnesses to die and the original archives to crumble. After a century, the lie becomes history, and the actual history becomes the kind of thing that only conspiracy theorists discuss. But the structures are still there. The 11-pointed star is still at the base of the most photographed statue in the world. The geometry has not changed. The alignment has not changed. The masonry can still be examined directly by anyone willing to look. And once you have seen it, you cannot unsee it. The Statue of Liberty was never about freedom. It is something older, stranger, and more specific than the public-facing narrative will ever admit. The 11-pointed star at her feet is the door, if you are willing to open it, to a much larger conversation about what was actually built in the world before the modern academic establishment decided what we were and were not allowed to remember. If this is the kind of investigation you came here for, you know what to do. Subscribe to the channel. Share this video with somebody who is willing to ask hard questions about the monuments we have been handed. And keep watching, because there is more to come. The star forts of the Americas are one chapter. The lost continental empire of Tartaria is another. The buried architectural record of the 19th century is another. We are working through them one at a time, and the more of us who refuse to look away, the harder it becomes for the next monument to stand on top of a structure that nobody is allowed to examine.